On March 12, 2013, Bob Dutko, radio talk show host and Christian apologist, responded to the first of my video examinations of his top 10 proofs for God's existence after months of emails from concerned listeners who felt I had really ripped Bob's arguments to shreds.
There's some guy who put together this YouTube series which, quote-unquote, debunks my top 10 proofs for God's existence. He decided to take my God's existence and put together, looks like some time went into this thing. And with pictures of me and my top 10 proofs series and whatever, and he calls them top 10 failed. Top 10 failed proofs or top failed 10 proofs. He's got the word, it's like top 10 proofs for God's existence, but he injected the word failed in there. So in other words, I failed at my effort to give these top 10 proofs for God's existence. So I'm assuming that this guy is an atheist guy. And so what he did was he went on the web and he basically takes each of my 10 and quote unquote debunks them, if you will. So I remember somebody had emailed me a few months ago about this. Bob, have you seen this? And I just kind of roll my eyes and laugh it off. And then after a little bit, somebody else had emailed me, oh, Bob, have you watched this guy make some good arguments or whatever? And how do you respond to that? And I'm just like, I just blow it off. So I'll get an email from one of my listeners maybe once every couple of weeks or so. Somebody else will send me an email going, Bob, have you seen this? This is Brett Palmer. He's debunking your top 10 proofs. I'd love to hear you respond to this. And so that's probably, 2 or 3 months ago or so. I was like, I'm going to see what this thing is. So I went ahead and I went online and I watched all 10 of his, and there's 10 different YouTube things that he set up, and each one of them is for one of my proofs. So the first one is for proof 1, the first one is for proof 2, and that kind of thing, debunking them. And as I was watching them, I kind of thought to myself, well, hey, this guy's got some time on his hands because it looks like he took the time to put together some little professional kind of refuting, Bob Dutko type thing. But then the other one was, and here's what I noticed as I watched these, I thought to myself, this is so easy to rebut his rebuttals. So a bunch of atheists are really feeding in on this, and they're like, oh boy, look at this. Yeah, boy, you did such a great, I was reading some of the comments. People are like, oh, you totally just trashed Bob Dutko, and you just ripped apart his reasoning, and boy, you just decimated him. And
Bob's show does not air here in the Denver area, and he does not archive online the audio from any of his shows. But one of his listeners let me know she had recorded the program and was gracious enough to send it to me when I asked. Now, I will not be reproducing the entirety of Bob's hour-long program in this video, as if I did a point-by-point rebuttal, this would likely stretch to over 2 hours. But will only be highlighting those relevant portions which relate to my video reaction to his top proof for God's existence, the first law of thermodynamics. If anyone who listened to his program, however, feels I missed something important in Bob's reply, please feel free to email or private message me with the details, and I will be more than happy to respond, as it is not my intention to exclude anything of substance. In his reply, Bob accused me of using all manner of debate tricks and tactics, including misdirection, red herrings, straw man, mockery, ridicule, and double talk.
Here's what I noticed as I watched these. I thought to myself, this is so easy to rebut his rebuttals. It's so easy to refute his refutations. Because the refutations are so weak if you can see through them, if you can cut through them. But the problem is that this guy, and he appears to be a fairly sharp guy, he uses a whole lot of debate tricks and tactics. And you folks know I've debated a lot of people on this show over the years. I know all of the debate tricks and all the debate tactics. And he uses many of them in this. to misdirect, to, red herrings and such straw man arguments and red herrings and mockery and ridicule and things like that, and a bunch of double talk to make it seem like he has debunked my proofs, when in fact he has not.
I don't want to spend time going over Bob's demeanor or tone in his reaction to my video, how he preps his audience before he plays any clips from it.
And by the way, as you listen to this, here's what I want you to keep in mind, okay? As you listen to this, I want you to keep in mind. And so as you listen to this next portion of his debunking of me, here's what I want you to listen for. Here's what I want you to listen to in this next bit. Here's a standard tactic that atheists use, and this is what he's going to go into next. This is what I want you to listen for. So basically, here's what I want you to listen for, folks. But then he went on. Here's what I want you to listen for next. So as you listen to this, folks, I want you to remember. He then goes on, and I want you to notice this.
I instead want to focus on the actual assertions Bob uses in his defense of the first law of thermodynamics as evidence of God's existence. After all, that's what this is really about. In a nutshell, Bob's response to my video included a misunderstanding about my claim that he doesn't understand the first law of thermodynamics and how it applies to the creation of the universe, a dismissal of my question that even if we do accept, hypothetically, that Bob is correct and God touched off the Big Bang, how did he do it? He then closed with an invitation to join him on his Friday call-in program. These are the highlights I will be covering in this reply video. Bob used his show to respond to my original video dealing with his top 10 proof of God's existence, the first law of thermodynamics, and how, being a law impossible to violate, it stood as evidence for a God which created the universe and would be the only being capable of actually violating this inviolable law. Bob explained it this way.
What I need to do is take just a couple of minutes and explain to you folks in very simple terms what the first law of thermodynamics is. I want to make sure everybody understands this, okay? Because what I'm addressing here in this first proof for God's existence is a scientific law. Within the first law of thermodynamics is something called the conservation of energy law. And it sounds all complicated and scientific, but one of the things I do on the show is take scientific or complicated principles and I simplify them so that everybody can understand them. And so, in very simple terms, a key principle of the first law of thermodynamics is that energy, you can't increase or decrease the total amount of energy. Energy can be converted into different types of energy. Energy can be converted into matter, and matter can be converted into energy. But however much total stuff you have, be it energy and matter or whatever, however much total stuff there is, you can't increase that total amount, you can't decrease that total amount. It has to stay the same. The amount has to be conserved. It's called the conservation of energy law. It's within the first law of thermodynamics. So that means you can't make something out of nothing. You're not able to do that. You can't make something out of nothing. And the argument here, and I think it's a very solid argument, is that there's either a God or there's not a God. In the no God scenario, the first law of thermodynamics would have to be obeyed. And most evolutionary scientists will now admit the universe had a beginning. At some point it had a beginning. So at some point we had nothing. And then suddenly we have everything. We have the entire universe. How do we go from nothing to something?
In my original video, I stated I would not school or try to educate Bob on the irrelevancy of the first law of thermodynamics as it relates to the creation of the universe. I said it's been done before and been done better than I could ever do. I placed graphics of Victor Stenger's book, God, the Failed Hypothesis, Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, and linked to a video lecture on the topic by Lawrence Krauss over these comments. All of these sources explain why the creation of the universe did not have to violate the first law of thermodynamics, otherwise known as the conservation of energy. Bob, however, misunderstood me and thought I was saying he didn't understand the first law. He even states that when he debated the same Victor Stenger, whose book I featured in my video, even Victor didn't criticize him for not understanding the first law.
It's ironic that Mr. Palmer would show a picture of Victor Stenger's book, because I've debated Victor Stenger on my show, and him and I debated the first law of thermodynamics on this show. And here's what I want to stress to you, okay? At no time in that interview did Dr. Stenger attempt to claim that my understanding of the first law was incorrect, or that I didn't properly understand the first law of thermodynamics. Not once. I want you to remember that as you're listening to what Brett Palmer says. So, and again, folks, I want to stress to you, you've heard many times, I mean, I've debated plenty of atheists and scientists on this show, and they disagree with me on my conclusions drawn. But I've never once had any of them say, oh, you're misdefining the first law of thermodynamics. No, that's not the case at all. So,
yeah, but what Bob misunderstands is that I never said that either. What I said was I was not going to get into the science behind why Dutko's use of the first law of thermodynamics fails, and was going to instead look at the implications of Bob's argument. If I had been referring to Bob's definition or understanding of the first law generally, why didn't I reproduce a picture of a physics book or simply text from a dictionary defining the first law? Why did I specifically isolate Stenger's and Hawking's books and link to Krauss's lecture? Because I was not taking exception to Bob's definition or understanding of the first law of thermodynamics, but his use of it as proof of God's existence. And that didn't change after listening to his show. He still doesn't understand how the creation of the universe was not a violation of the conservation of energy, and thus is useless as proof of God's existence. Bob stated that he'd much rather rely on the definition of thermodynamics from an astrophysicist than he would some guy on YouTube.
but remember, if astrophysicists accept my understanding, this is my argument here, folks. If astrophysicists, atheist astrophysicists, understand my understanding and acceptance, and accept my understanding of the basic principle of the first law, I think it's safe to say I don't need to be schooled by some YouTuber.
And I agree. I would much rather take the conclusions of an astrophysicist regarding the creation of the universe and the supposed violation of the first law of thermodynamics above that of a Christian radio talk show apologist whose educational background I can find nowhere documented online. And in all of Stenger's books and Hawking's writings and Lawrence Krauss's lectures, not once do they think the creation of the universe violates the conservation of energy, as Bob asserts, and as I will discuss in more detail in a moment. But note how creationists, like Bob, readily snuggle up to modern science only when it suits their purposes, like referring to astrophysicists' support of Bob's definition of thermodynamics.
Atheist astrophysicists understand my understanding and acceptance, and accept my understanding of the basic principle of the first law. I think it's safe to say I don't need to be schooled by some YouTuber.
But will abandon this very same science and scientists when it contradicts their literal reading of the Bible. This is why I and other atheists and skeptics find apologists and creationists so untrustworthy. It's not that the astrophysicists merely disagree with Bob's conclusions in debates.
I mean, I've debated plenty of atheists and scientists on this show, and they disagree with me on my conclusions drawn.
He's just demonstrably wrong when he hijacks this same science regarding the first law of thermodynamics. It seems to never occur to Bob that the reason the physicists and other scientists disagree with him is because he gets the science wrong. It should be no surprise to anyone that physicists disagree with Bob's conclusions, because those conclusions are not scientifically based. It's medieval thinking. Before science revealed the cause of sickness and disease to be in the microscopic world of germs, viruses, and genetics, some people attributed illness to the supernatural. Apologists like Dutko love to have it both ways. Atheists like me do not. If science were ever to discover evidence of God, I'd readily accept it. I'm consistent. What I don't accept are apologetics and misrepresentations of science used as polemic to convince the gullible that God exists. There's a huge difference there. If physicists were like Dutko, they would have seen a problem with the Big Bang and the first law of thermodynamics and allowed that a God must have created the universe, brushed the chalk off their hands, erased their blackboards, and moved on to some other problem in physics. But thankfully, physicists are scientists and not Christian radio talk show apologists, and so work goes on into the study of the creation of the universe. One of the things physicists have discovered, contrary to Dutko's $15 CD series, is that it was not necessary for the creation of the universe to violate the conservation of energy. As physicist Victor Stenger notes in his book, God and the Folly of Faith, the Big Bang is considered by theists as evidence for a creator. This is yet another invocation of the God of the gaps argument, but we don't have to wait for science to fill the gap. Ironically, the Big Bang has filled its own gap by providing natural explanations for the apparent violation of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Our best current observational evidence strongly supports a picture first proposed in 1980 by physicist Alan Guth and others called inflation. According to the inflationary cosmological model, the current Big Bang was preceded by a short period of rapid exponential expansion, lasting about 10 to the minus 35th power of a second. Inflation solved a number of problems with the prior Big Bang theory, and furthermore, implied that the total energy of the universe is zero. The theoretical prediction from inflationary cosmology that the energy of the universe is zero was confirmed by astronomical observations late in the 20th century. In short, zero energy was required to make our universe. Conservation of energy, the first law of thermodynamics, is not violated by a model in which the universe came from a state of zero energy, that is, came from nothing. Now, because of the quantum uncertainty principle, the energy cannot be exactly zero, that is, there is always a tiny zero-point energy. However, this does not affect our conclusion, since no miracle is required, no law of physics was violated. Likewise, in Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, if the total energy of the universe must always remain zero, and it costs energy to create a body, how can a whole universe be created from nothing? That is why there must be a law like gravity. Because gravity is attractive, gravitational energy is negative. One has to do work to separate a gravitationally bound system, such as the Earth and Moon. This negative energy can balance the positive energy needed to create matter, but it's not quite that simple. The negative gravitational energy of the Earth, for example, is less than a billionth of the positive energy of the matter particles the Earth is made of. A body, such as a star, will have more negative gravitational energy, and the smaller it is, the closer the different parts of it are to each other, the greater this negative gravitational energy will be. But before it can become greater than the positive energy of the matter, the star will collapse to a black hole, and black holes are positive energy. That's why empty space is stable. Bodies such as stars or black holes cannot just appear out of nothing, but a whole universe can. Because gravity shapes space and time, it allows space-time to be locally stable but globally unstable. On the scale of the entire universe, the positive energy of the matter can be balanced by the negative gravitational energy, and so there is no restriction on the creation of whole universes. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. And in the event Stenger and Hawking were not clear enough, here is theoretical physicist Professor Michio Kaku explaining a universe, the creation of which does not violate the conservation of energy, as Bob Dutko emphatically insists it must.
And so the universe could essentially be nothingness, which was unstable and created a soap bubble. Now you may say to yourself, well, that can't be right, because that violates the conservation of matter and energy. How can you create a universe from nothing? Well, if you calculate the total matter of the universe, it is positive. If you calculate the total energy of the universe, it is negative because of gravity. Gravity has negative energy. When you add the two together, what do you get? 0. So it takes no energy to create a universe. Universes are for free. A universe is a free lunch. And then you may say to yourself, well, that can't be right, because positive and negative charges don't cancel out. Therefore, how can the universe be made out of nothing? Well, if you calculate the total amount of positive charge in the universe and calculate the total amount of negative charge in the universe, and you add it up, what do you get? 0. The universe has 0 charge. Well, what about spin? Galaxies spin, right? But they spin in all directions. If you add up all the spins of the galaxies, what do you get? 0. So in other words, the universe has 0 spin, 0 charge, and 0 matter energy content. In other words, the universe is for free.
I sincerely hope the point has been made, and Dutko and his audience sufficiently educated as to why the creation of the universe does not violate the first law of thermodynamics, as Dutko so passionately, but erroneously, believes it should. The physicists have spoken. If Dutko wants to take this up with them, he is free to do so. But as I said, I'd rather take their word for it over and above a Christian apologist radio talk show host's. It's also the reason why I say inserting theological answers in place of our current ignorance is the opposite of obtaining knowledge. Saying God did it stunts scientific progress. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson discusses this in a presentation he made to a conference of scientists regarding the issue of intelligent design. He noted that many scientists throughout history have made astonishing discoveries which advanced human knowledge, none of which invoked a god as a necessary component of these discoveries. However, even these great scientists had their limits, and some of them, when reaching this limit, would indeed invoke God to explain what they couldn't. However, and inevitably, someone else would come along later and be able to explain atheistically what the previous scientist devoted to God.
Let me first start off with Ptolemy. I don't know if we know that he really looked like this, but Ptolemy, was one of the greatest scientists ever and most influential scientists. And his most important work is, of course, Almagest, which is Arabic for the greatest. And in it, he sort of codifies the geocentric universe. And this Earth-centered universe prevailed for centuries until Copernicus and Galileo turned that around. But what I want to call your attention to are notes that he penned in the margin of the manuscript of his work. Let me remind you that back then, you would look up at the night sky and the planets would move against the background stars. They would wander, because that's what the word means in Greek, is wanderer. And there were 7 of these objects, the sun and moon included. And they would just kind of move. They'd go to the left, and then they'd slow down and pause, and then they'd back up, and then they'd reverse again. And this was a mystery, complete mystery. And of course, the heavens were not Earth, and so the fact that you didn't really understand what was going up there was kind of okay and expected, because that was the work of the gods. And we, being mortal down here on Earth, if you can't understand it, don't lose sleep over that fact. You perhaps never will. Now, Ptolemy had sort of the best going explanation anyone had put forth with the epicycles and the like. But nonetheless, this is the boundary between what is known and unknown about how the machinery of the universe works, and he pens these words, which for me are one of the most beautiful and poetic references to the state of one's knowledge ever written. I know that I am mortal by nature and ephemeral, but when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies. I no longer touch earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. And so therein is this emotional, he's got this sort of religious feeling at the limits of his knowledge. And this is a trend that will continue for thousands of years to follow this. At least 2,000 years to follow this. And you don't have, and this whole notion of intelligent design, this is intelligent design. This quote that I just read to you is Ptolemy invoking intelligent design. No, he's not trying to get that into the classroom. He's not, there's the politics of intelligent design in modern times. But what I think has been swept under the rug that we have to contend with as a community of people who are sort of truth seekers is the fact that some of the greatest minds that have preceded us have done just this, okay? That's Ptolemy. But we can go on. But it gets interesting when we get sort of philosophically interesting when we get to this gentleman. I can back up here. Sir Isaac Newton. Now, I don't know what you know of Isaac Newton, but everything I've read of his tells me that there's no greater genius to ever walk the surface of this earth. I'm just I don't know if you've ever felt that about anybody. I didn't feel that about anybody. But you just read what this man wrote, okay? Line by line by line. This guy was plugged into the machinery of the universe. I think he's unimpeachably brilliant. Unimpeachably brilliant. And let me read again what we heard from Mike Shermer earlier. In Isaac Newton's writings, by the way, in his Principia, here's the page 1, page 0 of Principia, in it, he discovers the laws of motion, F equals ma, discovers the laws of gravity. It's all there. And he did this all before he turned 26. And in this, when he talks about motion, there's no reference to God. When he talks about his two-body force that he deduced, this universal law of gravitation, there is no mention of God. It's just not anywhere there because he understood it. He was on top of it. He was there. Even though the understanding of the motions of the planets before he came along was given unto God because nobody understood it, or nobody understood well enough to really believe that they had a full predictive handle on it in the way the universal law of gravitation supplied. And so what you have is Isaac Newton abandoning reference to God until he realizes that if all you do is calculate the two-body problem, here we have like the moon and earth. Yes, he's got that calculated. Now you have the sun and the earth. You got that. But wait a minute, now the earth and the moon go around the sun, and sometimes we're close to Mars and sometimes we're not. And when it comes near Mars, there's a tug that's stronger there than in any other part in the orbit. And then it comes over here, and then Jupiter tugs. And it's all these mini tugs. And so he's got to do this two-body problem for Earth, the moon, Earth and the sun, Earth, moon, and Mars, Earth, moon, Mars, and Jupiter, and it becomes a rapidly complex problem. And he realizes that, in fact, applying this simple sort of approach to calculating the stability of the solar system, he finds he can't stabilize the solar system. He can't account for how we have stayed this way for as long as what was possibly necessary from the beginning of the universe. And so what does he say? He's at his limits. He's at his limits. And so you read Principia, God is nowhere until you get to the general Sholem. And then he says the 6 primary planets. Back then there were 6 planets, okay? Now there's 8, in case you haven't been keeping track. Even if you thought there were 9, there are now 8. The 6 primary planets are revolved about the sun in circles concentric with the sun, and with motions directed towards the same parts and almost in the same plane. He's got the whole picture now, and he's trying to sort of account for that. But he can't just simply doing two-body calculations, certainly not without a computer or without a new kind of mathematics. He says, but it is not to be conceived. But is it not to be conceived that mere mechanical causes could give birth to so many regular motions? This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This is Isaac Newton invoking intelligent design at the limits of his knowledge. And I want to put on the table the fact that you have school systems wanting to put intelligent design into the classroom, but you also have the most brilliant people who ever walked this earth doing the same thing. And so it's a deeper challenge than simply educating the public. But let's move on, because there's more to talk about here. We don't have to stop at Newton. Let's go to Christian Huygens. All right? Brilliant scientist. I mean, he was great at chemistry, biology, physics, math. And so he's an important figure in the history of science. So what does he say in his writings? Well, you look at the year 1696, gravity was well known, laws of motion were well known, Newton was quite influential well before the turn of the century there. And so when he talks about the orbits of the planets, it's done. Talks about the moons of Jupiter, done. Talks about the new rings around Saturn, done. It's all fine. But when he talks about biology and life, something that's not well understood then or today, boom, there goes his references to God. But references to God were nowhere else in those writings.
And this is exactly what Bob and his creationist friends are doing, without ever advancing any of the science first. They perceive a gap in our current understanding of how the universe began, can't contribute to the science which advances our knowledge, and instead forces God into that gap. In a debate, for example, if an apologist's opponent cannot prove that a reported UFO is a hallucination, swamp gas, or a genuine interplanetary space vehicle, the apologist thinks their assertion that it was a demonic manifestation automatically wins. That sort of debate tactic isn't at all persuasive. As John Shook notes in his book, The God Debates, the naturalist should argue that science should be permitted to continue inquiring into nature wherever empirical inquiry may lead. It is not necessary to postulate anything outside of nature, while it is still sufficient that more and more explanations within nature can be achieved. Cosmology avoids falling into pseudoscience by postulating only natural explanations that can be tested by the scientific method. Theologians will not be impressed by science's never-ending exploration of nature. Nevertheless, postulating a supernatural and necessary God hardly seems any less a stretch of the imagination and only increases mystery. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. According to Dutko, his only argument with this first proof was to establish that the creation of the universe from nothing without the aid of a supernatural being was impossible because of an impenetrable barrier erected by the first law of thermodynamics.
I'm addressing the very simple binary issue of whether the universe is capable of coming into existence on its own without any inside influence. Plain and simple. This is only about proving scientifically that there must be some type of being capable of violating the first law. That's it.
And since Dutko's argument has been demonstrated to be false, there is indeed a scientific hypothesis for how the universe could have originated without violating the first law of thermodynamics. There is little left to say. Realize, while Bob said he was only trying to prove, scientifically, that there must be some type of being capable of violating the first law of thermodynamics, I was only demonstrating that such an argument is unpersuasive and was a miserable failure at its stated goal. I really didn't think Dutko needed me to hold his hand while I read to him from these sources, but apparently he did. I don't know if he genuinely didn't understand my reference to those sources, which is difficult to accept because no one else seemed equally as confused, or if he deliberately ignored them, dismissing the physics out of hand. Now, it very well may be that Bob could locate a physicist who would disagree with Stephen Hawking or Lawrence Krauss and state that the creation of the universe would indeed have violated the first law of thermodynamics. Let's assume for a moment that for every Professor Hawking, he could find an equally qualified Professor Smith, who held an opposite opinion to that of Professor Hawking, and for every Professor Kaku, Bob could scrape up an equally qualified Professor Brown, who disagreed with Professor Kaku. Would that prove his assertion true? Of course not. The best it could show is that the question isn't settled, and that science has more work to do. But the burden is still upon Dutko to provide that indisputable evidence that the creation of the universe violates the first law of thermodynamics, because he is using that as his own foundational proof for the existence of God. He cannot merely assert that the creation of the universe violates the law from his own ignorance, and then say the burden is upon the atheist or skeptic to prove him wrong. So even if Dutko drags up a legitimate source to back his claim, he will at best only be providing evidence of a controversy in science over the origin of the universe, not evidence supporting his first proof for God's existence. Either way, he still loses, using the first law of thermodynamics as proof of God's existence. I wonder if I can make that any more clear. To finish this section on the first law of thermodynamics, I'd like to clear up a mistake Bob made when he said I claimed matter and energy were eternal.
No, please call into the show and school me on this, because no, it's incorrect to say, well, then if matter and energy can't be created, which is true, then therefore it's eternally existed. No, once again, the second law of thermodynamics proves it cannot be eternally existent on its own.
I can school you just fine from here, Bob. First of all, you need to sit down and put on your listening ears. I never said matter and energy were eternal. It would do Bob well to listen to the words I use, and not the ones he wants to make me say. I try to be very careful with my word choices. I don't always succeed, but I try. I said in my original video that matter and energy, in one form or another, are eternal. In other words, matter and or energy, the stuff that makes up the entire universe, probably existed in some form prior to the Big Bang. The matter and energy we have now would have come from that prior state, whatever that state was. Unlike Bob, however, I'm not willing to definitively insist upon what this state was, whether it was natural or supernatural. I have my suspicions, but I really don't know. And once you cut through all the bluster and hand-waving, neither does he. Dutko emphasizes time and again throughout his program that atheists, while denying it, have faith in a universe that can be self-created from nothing.
And by the way, as you listen to this, here's what I want you to keep in mind, okay? You will hear him say that theists, talking about people like me, theists say we have a faith in atheism, that we accuse atheists of having a faith in atheism. And he says, we don't. He'll argue, we don't have a faith in atheism. Okay? As you listen to this, I want you to keep in mind, yes, they do, folks. They have a faith in some yet undiscovered explanation for the universe. Also, while they claim, quote, we just don't know either way, their default to argument is that there's no God. So they believe the universe came together somehow on its own. This is their belief, yet they refuse to admit, the atheists refuse to admit that they have a belief. So yes, you do have a belief. You do have a faith. You just don't want to admit it.
This is a blatant straw man, which Dutko erected for the sole purpose of knocking it around to delight his audience. We have very good demonstrable evidence that what at one time was an unknown for humanity is eventually, through the work of science, discovered to have a naturalistic explanation. In the history of science, God has never been uncovered as the answer to one of humankind's mysteries once that mystery was solved. Science works.
Okay, so the question's about the nature of scientific evidence. You both said, and I think most people here would agree with you, that we're justified in holding a belief if there's evidence for it or if there are logical arguments we can find that support it. But it seems like this in itself is a belief which would require some form of evidence. And so if so, I'm wondering what you think would count as evidence in favour of that, and if not, how do we justify choosing that heuristic without appealing to the same standard that we're trying to justify?
So how do we justify, as it were, faith that science will give us the truth? Is that the...
How do we justify scientific method?
Yes.
Basically, what he said.
It works. It works. Planes fly, cars drive, computers compute.
It's an inductive argument.
If you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works, bitches.
Atheists are not saying there is a naturalistic explanation for the beginning of the universe, because no one knows what caused the universe. Not atheist, not theist. The atheist is making no positive claim as to what caused the universe to expand and bring about space and time. What we are saying, or at least what I'm saying in my video series on the top 10 proofs for God's existence and why they fail, is twofold. 1. There is a plausible, although not absolutely proven, hypothesis which explains the creation of our universe without violating the first law of thermodynamics. And that hypothesis comes not from my own musings on the subject, but from the theoretical physicists who are studying the subject. And 2. The theist's explanation fails to support what they are claiming. It's really that simple. But because apologists like Dutko would rather try to shoehorn atheists into their preconceived notions about our positions, they can't, or refuse to hear us, and want to drag us down to their level of having faith in something for which there is no evidence. And again, Dutko refused to accept what I said about atheists not having faith.
All right, now, as I stressed to you before, and I want to say it again, they are kidding themselves. That is not true. They're in total denial about this. Yes, they do have a faith. They believe by faith that somehow in the future there will be a scientific discovery that will explain exactly how we went from nothing to something. They believe that somehow, without any scientific evidence for it, that nothingness just somehow sprang into an entire universe of existence. They believe that happened somehow, even though they can't explain how that happened. How can you tell me that's not a faith? You are having faith that that happened. You believe that that happened, even though you have no scientific evidence for that. So right there, folks, the atheist can try to go, you theists are accusing us of having a faith and a belief in atheism. That's just not true. No, we don't. Well, with all due respect, yes, you do. You're just in denial.
It is not true that atheists have faith that at some point in the future our Lord and Savior, the almighty science, will uncover the atheistic explanation for the beginning of the universe any more than we have faith that there aren't pink fuzzy unicorns dancing on rainbows. Most atheists I know, including myself, are open to receive the proper evidence that the universe had a supernatural origin. And if the day comes when such evidence is discovered and properly verified, we will accept it. But at this point in time, apologists like Dutko have no such evidence. Why does Dutko insist on putting words in my mouth? Because it's a debate tactic in order to score points with his audience. It's also a fallacy known as a straw man. Instead of taking what I said as what I said, Dutko creates this false Brett Palmer and goes to town wailing on him, saying I have a sort of faith I frankly don't have. My initial hope upon hearing that Bob had responded to my first video was that he'd answered the questions I'd posed in it. I'm going to stay away from schooling Dutko with the science related to the first law of thermodynamics and its so-called evidence for God. It's been done before, and it's been done better than what I could offer. I'd rather show the absurdity of making a claim, such as you can't create something from nothing, so let's postulate a super something to account for everything but explain nothing about this super something and how it could have created everything from nothing, which was just stated to have been impossible. I was anxious to hear Bob explain what this immaterial entity was and how it affected a material universe. Since we both agree that everything in the universe is made of either energy or matter, and that all created things are, were, or will be acted upon by other matter or energy, I was very hopeful that Bob would explain how something that isn't either matter or energy nonetheless created all matter and energy. Alas, I was severely disappointed.
He jumbles a bunch of words together, packages these in two red herring, irrelevant issues about, well, how did God do this? And tell us about this God.
I was merely asking that if Bob's claim is true, then he should be able to tell us something about this God and how it operates in the creation of the universe. I was actually asking for details which Bob fails to supply in his Goddidit assertion. But Bob stated he was in no way obliged to answer such questions, and indeed noted they were irrelevant to his first proof.
This is in an effort to trick the listeners into thinking that I've made a confusing, contradictory claim, when in fact I did not. He introduced these two red herrings of, well, tell us about this God, and tell us how this God did this. He is the one that made it sound confusing and tried to pass it on to me as making it confusing. I'm telling you, these are debate tactics and tricks that shrewd people use. This is all this guy's using.
Perhaps he's right. Perhaps the questions by themselves were inappropriate in the context of his merely trying to establish that the creation of the universe would have violated the first law of thermodynamics unless it was violated by a supernatural God. All he had to do was establish his base assertion, and anything else regarding this entity, who it was, how it operated, was irrelevant. But remember, my original videos are an explanation of why such proofs as Bob offers for the existence of God are failures at meeting their intended goal. In my first video about the first law of thermodynamics, I thought it was clear enough to those, like me, with even a rudimentary understanding of modern astrophysics, that the current model of the Big Bang does not violate the conservation of energy. Since those ideas in modern cosmology were dealt with in the first 4 minutes of my video, I decided to use the rest of the time and take Bob's proof a step further, and for argument's sake allow that a supernatural force got the Big Bang to initially bang. Doing so would raise additional problems for Bob, and I wanted to show how these additional problems just layer on the reasons why such theistic proofs for God's existence are so utterly unconvincing. They're good questions, and even if Bob said he didn't need to answer them, he did. But they were miserably disappointing answers. Dutko claimed,
I don't have to explain how God made something out of nothing. If he operates outside of the laws of physics, he doesn't have to obey them. These laws don't apply to him. So he can just speak matter and energy into existence.
But Bob, the laws of physics break down at the moment of the Big Bang, and we have good reason to accept that the universe's birth did not violate the first law of thermodynamics. Again, we don't need a God to violate the laws of physics in order to create a universe if those laws were not applicable when the universe made its initial bang. But what's really funny here is how Bob, like many apologists, tries to have it both ways. On the one hand, he claims his God is not bound by the laws of physics.
I don't have to explain how God made something out of nothing. If he operates outside of the laws of physics, he doesn't have to obey them. These laws don't apply to him.
But then he later says we non-theists are the ones believing in something that could violate the laws of physics, like a spontaneous universe coming from nothing which supposedly violates the first law of thermodynamics, and that they, the theists, do not.
And it's just believing something that violates the laws of physics. At least what we believe still obeys the laws of physics and honors them. We say, hey, laws of physics can't disobey themselves. You need a creator God capable of disobeying them. So at least we're using the laws of physics. You guys are believing in something that violates the laws of physics.
But what's God other than something which Bob just admits can violate the laws of physics? Apparently, for Bob and other like-minded theists, God is something which obeys and honors the laws of physics until it doesn't obey or honor the laws of physics. Bob's arguments are simply nonsensical and hypocritical. Also notice how Bob unwittingly admits the laws of physics stand outside and independent of God, inasmuch as such a God is required to violate them in order to create a universe. Now, when Dutko says his God is not bound by these laws of physics, he doesn't know this as a fact. It's just a speculation he has, which is a logical outcome regarding his belief in an all-powerful supernatural being. It would be like logically concluding that leprechauns are attracted to gold because, by definition, gold attracts leprechauns. But there's no evidence there is this God, just as there is no evidence there are leprechauns. So Bob is making no point whatsoever and is instead engaging in the logical fallacy of circular argumentation. At one point of his show, Dutko does finally get around to mentioning, however butchered, the atheistic explanation for the creation of the universe, but he dismisses it out of hand.
The atheist no-God scenario has already been proven scientifically impossible, unless you want to theorize that maybe, possibly, the laws of physics were different before the Big Bang, and that these so-called different laws of physics somehow allowed a universe to spontaneously create itself. Well, there's no evidence for that theory whatsoever.
He also specifically dismissed out of hand the same physicist whom he had earlier held captive to support his definition of the first law of thermodynamics, referring to Victor Stenger.
What Victor Stenger did is he merely tried to come up with a possible explanation to get around the first law of thermodynamics, like, well, maybe the laws of physics were different before the Big Bang or whatever. So,
how does Bob know there is no evidence that the laws of physics were different before the Big Bang? He merely needs to assert this so that he can have his God be the one who violates them. But his assertion is a complete falsehood. Again, Professor Michio Kaku.
The fundamental problem of cosmology is that the laws of physics as we know them break down at the instant of the Big Bang. Well, some people say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with having the laws of physics collapse? Well, for a physicist, this is a disaster. All our lives we've dedicated to the proposition that the universe obeys knowable laws, laws that can be written down in the language of mathematics. And here we have the centerpiece of the universe itself, a missing piece beyond physical law.
A spontaneous universe is no more bound to the laws of physics which would not have existed at the moment of the Big Bang, any more than those laws restricted an omnipotent God. For who this creator God was, or is, Dutko implied that for another $15 or $20, we could order another of his top 10 proofs CD sets where he explains it there. I checked through his offerings, but didn't see any which might define who God is. I thought I'd find something called Top 10 Reasons Why the God of the Bible is the God of Creation, or something like that, but I didn't find anything. Maybe it's under a more cryptic title and I simply missed it. But Bob will have to forgive me if I don't want to support him financially. Some of Dutko's listeners who commented on my video debunking his first proof for God's existence wanted me to go on Bob's show, taking up his invitation to join him for a live discussion.
These so-called refutations of my top 10 proofs are not refutations at all. They're just very intelligent-sounding double-speak and debate tactics and tricks using verbal smoke and mirrors that I've dealt with many times from the people that I've debated over the years. And I invite this guy or any of his followers to call me on any Free-for-All Friday and attempt to use the weak and lame arguments that he gives in this so-called debunking of me with a live interactive host who will pick them apart.
But I don't do live interviews, as I prefer to let people have their say, and I want to be afforded the same courtesy. In November of 2012, fellow YouTube skeptic and Texas State Director for American Atheists, Aaron Ra, was a guest on Dutko's show, covering this very topic of God's existence. I have nothing but the utmost admiration for Aaron and completely respect his decision to go on Bob's program. It's just not something I would do. On that show, Bob trotted out this proof from the first law of thermodynamics, and Aaron admitted he was not a cosmologist and couldn't comment fairly on the creation of the universe. Bob, as he did on his show covering my video, tried to force Aaron into a position in which he must have faith that the universe came from nothing by itself, atheistically. Aaron protested that this was not his position, but Bob would hear nothing of it. listen to this chaos.
What you're attempting to do is basically you realize you've been backed into a corner with the existence of
Wait,
God.
whoa,
You
whoa,
cannot.
whoa.
You
No.
cannot. No, hold on. Wait just a second. Okay,
said you
sir,
wouldn't come into
let
my
me
rabbit hole.
hold on
That
just
means I'm
hold
on
on
the-
just a second. Let me
there's no
hold
corner
on.
you
Just
could back me
wait. Just
into.
hold on just a second. All right, because
You're the
I have
one with
listen,
the position
Mr. Ra,
that you have
Mr.
to
Ra,
defend.
Mr. Ra. Listen,
have the-
listen.
wait,
Hold
you have
on.
the
Let me
position that you need to
respond.
defend. I
Listen, Mr. Ra.
It's
I have
therefore not
allowed you,
possible
sir,
for you to back me into a corner.
Sir, listen. I have.
Can it?
Now, listen to me a second. I have allowed you to make mocking and ridiculing comments about my God being a genie who said abracadabra, who I can think I have evidence for creation refuting evolution, but I don't.
But
You
you
can
demonstrated
make,
so.
hold on a second. You can make these declarative statements, and I allow you to do that because I understand that's the perspective you come from. But when I make a declarative statement that you've been backed into a corner on a particular issue, suddenly you go crazy and you don't want to give me an opportunity to finish my point. So what I'm saying to you is this. Whether you want to admit it or not, you have been backed into a corner on the existence of
It is
God.
not possible to back
since
me
you
into
can, and
a
since
corner.
you can, Mr. Ra, please, and
Since
since
I
you
don't have
can,
a
and
position,
since you
a
can,
belief system
Mr. Ra,
to defend,
Mr. Ra,
then it is not
and-
possible to back me into a
See,
corner.
Who wouldn't want to be part of something like that? I'd love to be misrepresented, told I've been painted into a corner, and then talked over. No thanks. Also, I like to research my opponent's points, thoughtfully consider them, look at them from all sides before I formulate a response. For me, it's not about style points. I need elbow room. I like to develop and properly explain my position, and that takes time, and not the sort of time which fits the format of a debate or radio talk show. On this same program with Aaron and Dutko, the conversation veered from the intended topic and drifted toward a discussion about dinosaurs living alongside human beings. That was when Bob was able to use an old debate trick.
You give me one single example that you will announce
Are you
on
ready?
here that can be scientifically verified to be authentic and be a human, a pre-Columbian human
I'll give it to-
representation of a dinosaur, whatever you want.
I can give you over 30 of them. Right now, I could give you over 30 of them. Let me give you, just one or two. For example, in the Arizona Historical Society, ancient swords were excavated near Tucson, Arizona. They were excavated in 1924. The swords are referred, by the way, on page 331 of the book Lost Cities of North and Central America. You can look it up for yourself. They have various artwork designs carved into them. One sword has an exact brachiosaurus carved into it. If you look at this, you can show it to anybody. It looks exactly like it came out of a Jurassic Park movie. The Arizona Historical Society owns the sword. You can look at that picture of the brachiosaur. There's nothing ambiguous about it at all. You can't say, the ears aren't right. Nothing along those lines. That's one of example of 30 of them that I can give you right now. I would encourage you to look that up. You asked me to give you one, that's one. If you want two, I'll give you two. You want three, I'll give you three. We could spend all afternoon as I go through those.
On radio, or even in a live debate, an apologist can throw out a reference, like the one Dutko made to this Arizona sword with the carved brachiosaur, and the apologist's opponent, in this case Aaron Ra, has no opportunity to look up the reference, research it, and see if it supports the claim the apologist is making with it. So, by merely making the unsupported assertion regarding the so-called sword depicting an engraving of a dinosaur, Dutko wins debate points, because Aaron is made to look like a skeptic who can't respond to the evidence raised by the apologist right as the reference is being made. And while Dutko encouraged his listeners to check into his reference, how many will actually take the time to get it appraised by an informed, independent source and not simply rely upon the word of the apologist? When they look at the sword, will anyone be there to point out that only reptiles like snakes and lizards have forked tongues, and not dinosaurs? Who will notice that Bob's book was published by Adventures Unlimited Press, a bookseller which also produces and markets books about Atlantis, UFOs, and Bigfoot? Now, Aaron was able to do an outstanding follow-up to his appearance on Dutko's show on his blog and call out Bob's ludicrous sword example. But the damage had already been done. While Aaron invited listeners of Bob's show to check out his blog after the program, how many of Dutko's listeners will actually have the courage to do so? Apologists and creationists have a track record of, let's face it, dishonesty. I don't trust them, and thus I won't take their bait. Just look at Bob's so-called refutation of my first video looking at this supposed first proof for the existence of God using the first law of thermodynamics. He misunderstood or deliberately ignored the heart of my position, misrepresented other points I had made, used mockery and misdirection in his reply, and you wonder why I wouldn't want to enjoy the pleasure of meeting the man for a one-on-one. Frankly, he hasn't earned that privilege. Regardless, I happen to think debates in general are a waste of time, and debates with apologists or creationists are futile and counterproductive. So for these reasons, I will never go onto Bob's or any other apologists or creationists' radio show, TV program, podcast, or live debate. In his attempt to defend the truth, and reply to my video debunking his claim regarding the first law of thermodynamics as proof for the existence of God, and trying to characterize me as a double-talking atheist trickster from YouTube, Bob Dutko ended up doing violent harm to the real truth, and just digging the hole deeper for himself. The examination of these proofs was never about Bob personally in the first place. Such arguments for God's existence, from the first law of thermodynamics to the claim that biological evolution is impossible, are passed around incestuously among apologists and creationists, with none of them being able to claim exclusive rights to any of them.
Now, I happen to be a little old-fashioned. I think in science class we should be teaching science. Things we can observe and study and test and demonstrate. Things like the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics tells us matter cannot be created or destroyed. Well, everything's made out of matter, so if matter cannot be created or destroyed, then how did the world get here? We're here, you know. So that leaves only two choices. Somebody made the world, or the world made itself. There's no other choice. So either somebody made the world like the Bible says, God created it, or the world just made itself like the humanists believe. It just is self-existing and not created. Well, if the world just made itself, how could this happen? Boy, the devil thought about that for a long time, and finally one day he came up with the Big Bang Theory.
Hi, I'm Bob Knopf with Creation Science Network, and today we're going to talk about how science shows that God exists. Now, logically, there can only be two ways that the universe and the heavens and humankind got here. We were either created by an all-powerful, almighty God, or we would have had to create ourselves from nothing. Now, another law that we can look at is the first law of thermodynamics. This law states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Now, if we think about that, that's amazing. And these are laws of science. These aren't theories. These are laws on which science hangs its hat. So what we have is we have a creator either making things or things had to make themselves, which is impossible according to the first law of thermodynamics.
Thermodynamics is awesome! It's what a lot of us might like to call scientific. It forces me to conclude that we have two camps. In the one camp we have biblical Christianity. But over here in the other camp, we have those that oppose biblical Christianity, and that's things like evolution, atheism, the Big Bang. Now, when I look at the laws of thermodynamics, the observable, repeatable, testable laws, I would have to admit that one of these two camps actually lines up with real science. But if only I could figure out which one it is.
So while I may have used Bob Dutko's examples of these arguments, I was fully aware that he wasn't the original author of them. Dutko didn't understand that he was misusing the first law of thermodynamics as a proof for God's existence. My criticism was never about his definition of the first law, but his assertion that the creation of the universe somehow violated that law. Furthermore, Dutko failed to grasp that the laws of thermodynamics did not predate the universe. They weren't floating around like some sort of motorcycle cop patrolling the timeless, spaceless, immaterial void before the Big Bang, making sure nothing popped into existence from this nothingness to violate them. The laws of thermodynamics, indeed all the laws of physics, only came into existence with the birth of the physical universe. One cannot have physical laws governing space, time, and matter if space, time, and matter do not exist. So it is impossible that whatever it was that caused the universe to begin its initial expansion violated any laws of physics whatsoever. But claiming it did sounds good to those who don't know any better and want to get their science education from a Christian radio talk show apologist. The bottom line here is that no one currently knows for certain how the universe began. It appears it may have just begun spontaneously, without any identifiable cause. But like I said in my first video, physicists are still working on this question, and stumbling blocks like the so-called answers Dutko uses to evidence the existence of his God actually stunts the advancement of scientific knowledge. Human ignorance is never evidence for anything other than the ignorance itself. One cannot squeeze God into gaps in our current state of knowledge and think that is sufficient proof for God's existence. The best thing fans for Dutko's show can do for themselves, and this actually is good advice for everyone, is to turn your radio off. If you have questions about how the universe began, don't drop your $15 on a CD set by a Christian radio talk show apologist. Use it instead to buy a book by Stephen Hawking or anyone else with the legitimate credentials to, if you'll forgive the pun, faithfully answer your questions. Or use the money to attend a lecture or help towards the tuition fee to enroll in a university-level class on the subject. Or even just pocket your hard-earned money and go down to your local library, pull books off the shelf for free. You'll receive a much better education and actually bring yourself closer to the truth.